to Zoom in, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan and the Asia Pacific region. I'm Jeremy Olivier. The new U.S. administration of Donald Trump is ramping up efforts to boost its shipbuilding industry, which over the past few decades has been greatly eclipsed by China's. The renewed focus on this sector shows that tech is not the only area in which Washington is looking to compete with Beijing. To explore what this means for the US and its partners, I'm joined today by Matthew Funaiole, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He's also a co author of the recent report Ship Wars Confronting China's Dual Use Shipbuilding Empire. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, just to get started, we do know that China's shipbuilding capacity has expanded greatly since the turn of the 20th century. What kinds of challenges does this present to the US?
Well, there's really a few different interrelated challenges that it poses. The one that's getting a lot of attention right now in DC is on the economic front. China is over 50% of the market share, and it is just growing and growing and growing, attracting new orders. And that's really pushing other competitors out of the market. Now, the US hasn't been a huge factor in shipbuilding for quite some time. So, really, that squeeze is on some of our allies that are leaders like South Korea and Japan. But on top of the economic issue, there's really some national security concerns that go along with it as well. China's huge domestic shipbuilding capacity, that's helping to fuel its ongoing naval buildup, so that's a concern for the United States. And the other factor is that the shipyards themselves, most of the big ones, most of the major ones that we're looking at, these are dual use facilities, meaning that they're producing both commercial ships and military vessels at the same time. And what we're seeing and what we saw in a lot of our research is that foreign capital is actually flowing into these shipyards in a number of different ways, helping to subsidize the cost for China's ongoing military modernization.
So, in what ways is the US trying to counter what's happening in China, and has it been effective so far?
Well, there's a lot of momentum for this right now, as you sort of mentioned at the top of things. But it's not really something that's new. During the first Donald Trump administration, he kind of started talking about shipbuilding, specifically looking at icebreakers. There was a lot of momentum during the Biden administration, and now we're seeing even more interest in it now. And there's a few different things that are happening. The U.S. Trade Representative conducted a 301 investigation last year looking to see whether or not China had used unfair trade practices to gain an upper hand in the industry. And then earlier this year, it came out with some recommendations about how to confront that, looking at things like putting fees on Chinese vessels that dock at U.S. ports. And that's still underway. We're still kind of looking and trying to understand exactly how that might materialize. We also expect there to be an executive order on shipbuilding in the next couple of weeks. And there's also the SHIPS Act, which is another piece of proposed legislation to help revitalize the U.S. shipbuilding industry.
So, can you talk a little bit more about the SHIPS Act and how it might fit into the US's strategy in countering China's dual use shipyards?
So the SHIPS Act, which is probably going to get reintroduced to the floor at some point this year, is really trying to do a couple of different things. One is how do we revitalize U.S. industry, U.S. shipbuilding industry? What kind of tax incentives can we provide? What other types of incentives are there that we can use to help build up the industry? How can we attract foreign capital into U.S. shipyards? So there's that component of it. There's also a workforce component to it as well, right? It's not just about the industry itself. It's not just about the infrastructure itself. You also have to have the workforce in order to actually build the ships. And so there's a lot of provisions in there for how do we build up that capacity domestically. And interestingly, one of the things that it sets out is for the U.S. to actually develop a strategic commercial fleet of 250 vessels. This would be U.S. built vessels, U.S. flagged vessels, U.S. manned vessels that would serve a number of different functions, but would be specifically for strategic commercial interests.
So, one of the key findings of your recent report is that a fair number of US allies, including Taiwan, are looking to China for a significant amount of their fleets. How is it that these countries became so reliant on China for their shipbuilding needs?
This is a big question, and I think it's similar to the story we've heard a number of different times when it comes to China, right? China's able to mobilize its massive economic strength, put state support behind specific industries, behind specific state-owned champions. And what it does is it squeezes competitors out of the marketplace. And that's really what we've seen over the last 2 decades. If you go back to the early 2000s, China was only 5% of the shipbuilding market. Now it's over 50%. And there's been subsidies been in play, but also they produce ships quickly. They produce ships cheaply and they produce good ships. And so market factors are really just driving companies to China. But I think we've kind of hit a point now where we can't just let market factors be the only thing we're taking into account when we're looking at this type of engagement with China. We really do have to think about the national security implications as well.
So, given that these are commercial vessels, in what way does their construction by China benefit that country's military?
I mean, there's a few different factors to think about when you're looking at commercial and military production. Up front, I do want to clarify that they're not the same thing, right? There's different types of technology, there's different processes, there's different personnel that are involved in them. But what we've seen, and we've observed this through years of satellite imagery analysis at CSIS, is that China has undertaken a comprehensive effort to consolidate at some of its biggest industries, expand those actually out, and blur the lines between commercial and military production. And there are benefits to that, right? It's not a perfect system, but there's benefits to that. A big one is that you help to offset the fixed costs of the shipyards with that foreign capital that you're getting for those commercial purchases. These are massive enterprises. These are huge infrastructure projects. And so if you can have, dry docks and gantry trains and floodable basins, and you're building all of those and expanding all of those, and some of the cost of those are being offset by foreign capital that's flowing in, well, you're making it cheaper to build up your naval assets that are also using those same facilities. There's also a cyclical component of this as well. What we've observed is that when shipyards are getting a tremendous amount of new shipbuilding orders, they'll convert a lot of this capacity over to commercial production. And when there's a lull in that, we see an uptick in a lot of the military production at these facilities. And so there's this blurring that's occurring at these shipyards. And it gives China a lot of different ways in which it can leverage that. It can leverage it for commercial might, it can measure it for military might.
Taiwan already has a well developed shipbuilding industry. So, why are companies like Taiwanese shipping giant Evergreen now turning to China to build parts of their fleets? Is it simply a matter of cost?
It's two factors really. It's capacity and cost. And we see the same thing in places like Japan and South Korea, which are two of the biggest ship producers in the world. Taiwan, if you look at the global scale, only produces a small percentage of global tonnage, but even that is not enough to satisfy Evergreen and other Taiwanese shipping companies. And so you have China's just massive market. It's able to produce ships quickly. It has the capacity to produce them, and it's able to do so in a relatively short amount of time and at a low cost. I think one of the real big challenges here for Taiwan is thinking about what the implications are for that. You mentioned Evergreen. Evergreen is one of the companies that we look at in detail in our report, and they have been purchasing ships from shipyards that are known to produce surface combatants for the PLA. And we've observed through satellite imagery, you can see an Evergreen vessel being constructed right outside a destroyer for the PLA, and it raises some questions about should Taiwan be sending money into these shipyards, especially given how China uses its fleet for coercive purposes.
You and your co authors have given several recommendations for US policymakers on addressing the challenges posed by China's dual use shipyards. Can you give us just a few of the top ones in order of priority?
I think the first thing is trying to dissect the problem. There's over 300 active shipyards in China, and not all of them are part of its massive security apparatus. And so, what we did in the report is we actually went through and we classified each one of those to determine which ones are the highest risk, which ones are the lowest risk. In the short term, it's unlikely that we're really going to be able to drive companies to not buy ships from China. There's too big of a part of the marketplace. But what we can do is that we can try to discourage companies from buying ships from those shipyards that are most responsible for China's ongoing naval modernization. So I think that's one of the big things that we should be able to do. The other two really think about is the best way to think about it is how do we work with our allies and partners on this issue set? There's options for building up shipbuilding capacity in Japan and in South Korea, and there's also options for trying to attract capital into the United States from companies that are interested in getting access to the US market. So all of those really factor into it. One point I'd like to stress that I think this is really important that comes out of the research is that it's important to be forward looking here and not just looking at past behavior. And so some of the proposed measures by the US Trade Representative are on looking at companies and what their fleet composition is and penalizing them if they have over a certain percentage of Chinese built vessels in their fleet. And there's a lot of reasons why that could work, but there's also some concerns about what happens with those costs and how those get passed on to consumers. But one thing that we advocate for in the report is, while that's a good first step, you should really be looking at future activity rather than past purchases. China's already gotten the money from purchasing those vessels. So what you really want to do is try and de-incentivize companies from funneling more money into China in the future and make sure that whatever penalties you're putting into place, they're really directed at China and not directed at other countries.
Looking at the data you collected, the US's share of shipbuilding is so much smaller than China's at this point. I just have to ask whether policy alone can really go how far policy alone can really go in leveling the playing field.
I mean, we need to be clear-eyed about what this looks like. The disparity is massive, right? And so this is not going to be something where overnight or even 5 years or even 10 years down the line, the US is going to be on a comparable level to China. And I'm not even really sure that that should be the goal of what this is. I think what we've identified is that the US has a deficiency in its commercial shipbuilding capacity. And rather than trying to compete with China, we should really be looking at ways to satisfy our own economic and national security interests. And I think that starts with trying to build up some capacity that could support a commercial fleet that would be relevant for a number of different strategic purposes, but that doesn't necessarily mean becoming the world's biggest shipbuilder. Can policy itself do it? Policy is a start, right? It can help to provide incentives for companies to get there. But you really have to do a couple of things. You have to get the private sector on board with this, and they need to understand why this is important for the United States. And ideally, we really need allied and partnered countries to be thinking along the similar lines and thinking that having this overdependence on China does raise concerns. It does raise national security risks. And so we should look to ways that we can build up capacity outside of China.
So how do you get US corporations to buy into some of these strategies when they could hurt their bottom line in the short term?
Tax incentives is one big way of doing it, right? And I think you can also offer other types of incentives to companies for using US built or maybe allied built vessels as opposed to Chinese vessels. So if we take the US Trade Representative proposal, for instance, right, it's looking at fleet composition and saying, if your fleet is over this percent of Chinese built vessels, you're going to have to pay this fee every time you arrive at a US port. And it looks like there's a lot of momentum for this. It looks like some version of that is going to come into place. The specifics of it will change, but some version of that is likely to emerge. Well, for companies that are showing momentum and desire to try and move away from Chinese dependence, you could offer them exceptions to those kind of fees. You could offer them tax credits as well for some types of investments they're making into the U.S. So there are measures that the U.S. can use.
So how can the US incentivize its partners and allies, specifically those in Asia, to help it build up its shipbuilding prowess?
So I think there's, a few things to really keep in mind here, and that is that the United States is facing, a challenge and a threat from China, and so are our allies and partners in the region. And so with shipbuilding and with a number of different spaces, that could go from military cooperation, that could go to the technology exchanges, it could go from personnel exchanges, it could go from any type of exchanges with our allies and partners. There's always an opportunity to really look at the threat assessment and say, despite our differences, despite some of the concerns that we have bilaterally with one another, we have a bigger concern that we really need to deal with. We want to make sure that we maintain democracy, liberal international order, the rules-based international order, and in doing so, we have to find ways of partnering together. Shipbuilding is just one part of a much bigger challenge that we face when it comes to China.
It was a very alarming but fascinating report. So I really appreciate you coming on the show today to share your insights with us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from Taiwan Plus, please visit our website or our social media. I'm Jeremy Olivier. Take care and see you next time.